live? We are live. Okay, so next mission here. We are going to orbit today. We are taking Valantina and we are going to fly her toward the North Pole, and she is going to get into orbit and then she's going to come home. We just have to kick Jeb out of the pilot's seat. There you go, Valantina. So, bigger rocket than before, not too complicated. Couple of solid rocket boosters, a decent stack with a turnable engine, and at the top we've got our space-rated engine. Plenty of fuel for it because we are going to be doing some fun things today. And above that we've got our processor core. This is actually, everything from here up is going to land. So we've got our KOS processor with some solar panels on it so we can charge it up. There's a couple of batteries snuck in there. You can see the dim dot. We have our science. It's all kind of crammed together inside this guy. And we have Jeb sitting here. Well, Valantina. Valantina will be able to do some science. She won't be able to reset the goo and the material science. However, I believe that goo and material science are only once on orbit, so that won't be a problem. I will be doing this flight 3 times. So, beginning of this stream, I'm going to fly the whole thing once, and we're just going to go up and circularize and come right back down wherever we are. And once we've landed, I will rewind to the launch point. So we're going to see the entire mission once. Second time through, and those of you that are bored with the math and bored with the software engineering can cut out at that point. Second time through, I am going to have the flight control software pause each time it announces a new phase. I'm going to have it pause there so we can talk about what's happening in the next phase, and we can watch just that phase and then go look at the code, and in the cases where the code is interesting. Some of the phases are going to be trivial, but for things like the launch ascent phase and the circularization phase, there's some interesting code to look at there. And after we do that run, that will be the end of the stream, and after the stream I will do a third launch with Val, and we are basically going to go around Kerbin over and over and over and over again until I can manage to do an EVA over each biome, because each one of those EVAs gets me science. And right now we need a whole bucket of science. We need hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of science. This mission, once we have completed it, we will start getting demands from tourists who will now, before they wanted to go up on a suborbital hop just up to space and back, now we're going to start getting tourists that want to go into orbit, and they will pay us more. That's good. So, without further chit-chat, let's watch Val do the whole thing. Well, poor Val. Val is a pilot, but Val is going to be sitting there in her chair while our artificial intelligence in the part here, which is a scriptable control system, our artificial intelligence sitting there in the scriptable control system is going to do all the work. All she has to do is tap the brakes on orbit. Once we get to orbit, I've set it up so that if you turn on your brakes, which normally does nothing when you're in space, the autopilot will notice that and will say, it's time to come home. We can see the actual software for the mission. I showed the tourist hop, and it looked this small. The difference is that I had to do code folding, so each one of these phases was 5 to 10 lines of actual software, and now it's just a delegate to a function in the phase package. So other missions can put this together in any order they want. Now, some of these will always appear in the same order. We're going to pretty much pre-flight, launch, ascent, coast-to-coast, circularize. This is going to be a really common segment to see. And same thing at the end. We're going to deorbit, decelerate, yada, 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 all the way down through park. So it's possible that what I will do is I will also export from phase some common phase lists. And well, you have a way of doing that. You can do multiple mission add statements. Anyway, so let's go fly. Enough chatter. Last check yo staging. We have there and there and there and there and that and then that and then that and then that, and all of those are separate. So when we're staging, we are going to detach, pause, ignite. So no thunder staging for me. Yay! Launch. Sometimes it takes a while for KSP to get everything loaded. So there's our announcement. We are Speedily Abandoned Weight. And it is saying, please press spacebar to start. And it should have repeated that. Nope, it doesn't. I was going to put in a reminder to press spacebar, but I guess I didn't do that on this one. Well, let's do it anyway. So I hit spacebar once, and the automatic stager handled decoupling from the gantry. And I'm not sure why these are sticking. That's wild. I can't get rid of these. There. Click away. Click away and click back. Now this is a different launch. You notice I am launching to the north. This is because I want to go around and around north to south while Kerbin rotates underneath me. And once again, I am doing something I shouldn't do. I have not pre-run this particular thing. I have tested these bits. I know all the bits work, but I haven't put them together in a polar orbit yet. So we are still in the ascent phase. Prior versions of the code, you stayed in the ascent phase and you pushed your apoapsis up to be significantly higher than your goal, and then we just coasted. This time we're doing it a little differently. We pushed it up to exactly what we want, and when it falls below what we want, we run the throttle very briefly. So you notice that our apoapsis is getting down to 80 kilometers. It's going up by maybe 10 meters when I burst the engine. 5 meters that time. I shudder to think about doing the math, which will calculate how much thrust do I do for how long to raise my apoapsis by 10 meters, for instance. Or how to, or do a controller that is that fine grained, because this little teeny tiny bursts of thrust are doing it. This is good enough. Oh, and we are now in the coast because we have gotten out of the atmosphere. Once we're above the atmosphere, I know that my apoapsis is not going to decay on me, so we can go to the coast phase. And that will last until 30 seconds before apoapsis. And here we are, and it's going to start circularizing. Now, one way to circularize is to pre-compute exactly what the delta V you want is, and then try to pre-compute the duration and do it. And what you just saw there was a staging in the middle, which blows away all those computations. So what I do instead is I say, I am going to circularize my current altitude. I figure out, given my current altitude, what the proper speed is, and I point in that direction. I say, okay, that's the vector I want, and look at my current velocity. I say, correct it. And then we just use a simple proportional controller to apply a bit of thrust to make our velocity more like what we want. And we repeat that over and over and over and over again. Each time we do, we beat the error down, and in the end, the error kind of approaches zero. And when it gets small enough, we say we're done circularizing. If we look here on the orbit information, you can see that our apoapsis has been pulled down a bit because we started circularization at a lower altitude. In fact, we are descending, so we have gone past our apoapsis. We're coming back down. We're still trying to circularize. So we may need to start circularization earlier. I may need to actually do a computation at some point. And there we have it. So we lost 5 kilometers in that process due to starting at the wrong time, possibly. We may have started too late, which is why we were still circularizing on the way down. We're using a space engine, which is very efficient, but it's not high thrust. Our thrust to weight ratio is not showing here. It's 1.83, so I was wrong about it not being high thrust. We should have been able to do that pretty promptly. So at this point, you're hearing in the background a little blurp happen each time we change from, we go from over one biome to over the next biome. And if the new biome has science that we need to do, it's going to make that little noise. And in our case, we're interested in the EVA reports. Apparently, we have already done material study in mystery goo on orbit. I can take another sample of those and get 5 or 6 more research points. Let's do that. So we are going to conduct a material study. And see, we got 5.5 science out of that. And then we are going to observe the mystery goo. And that's half a science. That's good. Oops, I hit the wrong one. Observe mystery goo. Don't reset it. Keep it. And just in case these get destroyed on the way down, I also have a science lab. Oh, I ought to move that up into the capsule in case this gets destroyed. We're going to collect all. And close the doors. There we go. So Val has done her science for the day. And we could take her EVA and start taking EVA reports for all those bloop bloops happening in the background, but we're going to do that later. I'm going to do that off stream. Key thing now is that we can hit the brakes until it starts decelerating. Apparently I need to hold the B key instead. There we go. So when it says hit the brakes, the button isn't good enough. I need to actually hold down on the B key. Okay, that toggles it. So I should have been able to click that once and it would have just done it. So we deorbited, which lowered our periapsis to under 35 kilometers. I'm arbitrarily saying deorbit is lower your periapsis to half of the height of the atmosphere. And now we're in the fall phase where we're going to just let ourselves glide down At some point we will light up the engines and finish decelerating, because we have 744 meters a second of fuel left that we can use to slow our fall. Now, I'm not going to worry about grabbing science this flight, mostly because we're going to revert this to launch and do an in-depth examination of these flight phases. I think really there's only two I want to look at. There's the ascent phase, where we're going to want to go over the math and then watch it well, look over the math quickly and then watch what it actually does. And the circular orbit, well, now that I think of it, I don't think I need to repeat the flight for that. I will need to repeat the flight so I can stay on orbit and get all the science, which is going to take a long time. But yeah, we won't really go over that stuff I won't have to refly on stream. I will just pop up the math and we can discuss it. Now you notice that since I didn't decelerate by much, there's our orbit, and our periapsis is down here somewhere. Yeah, we don't have any upgrades in our map room, so I can't see all of that stuff. But our periapsis is at 33 kilometers. It's probably down here, and we have to go a long ways around to get there. So I am going to hit the warp. Oh, okay, so each time we go a blurp, it's going to unwarp us. So I'm going to turn that off like that. Let's go up to 50x. Why did it stop us again? We are now in the atmosphere. That was great timing there, Greg. So let's use physical warp to bring us in at 4 times speed. So one thing that worries me is when we start talking about the ascent, I'm actually locking my heading onto the launch azimuth. And for equatorial orbits, that's correct. For polar orbits, it's also correct until you take longer than 90 degrees to get to altitude, in which case it just goes crazy. For inclined orbits, instead of following the great circle, so we're supposed to be doing a circle like this, it would go up and it would spiral, so it would kind of turn left, so it got closer and closer to the pole, maintaining a bearing rather than maintaining the great circle. So if I want the inclined orbits to be perfect, I will have to do the math and figure out the correct heading during ascent. But this is the orbit we get when we say, please burn starting from the launch site. Ooh, with it at the 0 azimuth, and wow, I should have been watching. We got down into 35 kilometers or so, and wow, lots of stuff. And at this point, we have a problem because we weren't able to hold our attitude with the heat shield in front of us. So I've got a really great reason I'm going to have to revert, because we need better attitude control. I need to put on some RCS here. Well, not RCS jets, but the RCS wheels. But how bad is this? We have mostly decelerated, so it could be that, Val just has to maybe get a little space sick there for a moment, and we're moving slow enough. I've got my gear out, I've got my chute out, and I'm pointed straight down. Well, it's exciting. I'm going to leave the code alone. Leave the spacecraft alone. Let's just go with this. And there's our touchdown. So, that one little parachute is not good enough for that amount of stuff that we are landing, even with the landing legs. So, revert to vehicle assembly. Now, before I start working on this and fixing it up, let's look at the code and then I'll call it a stream. So, bring up the code editor and make it full screen. So, what do we have here? The interesting phases are going to be the ascent phase and the circularization. So there's the code for ascent there on the left. Fairly simple. I've tried to keep the names readable. So what are we doing here? We're trying to do a simple proportional control. Well, not even proportional control. We're just following a pitch pattern. We've pre-programmed pitch program that says, depending on our altitude, we're going to select a pitch. So we've got a gain that we can program, and all these persist gets, these are parameters we could alter from the mission. So we select our altitude. If our apoapsis is already at or above that altitude and we're already over the atmosphere, then we're done. We have a gain. Yeah, this is the last thing I added was a small proportional controller, so that if we were close to the correct altitude, we would give a small amount of thrust. So that's the ascent gain is a gain factor. Increase wanted is how much more apoapsis, how much more we want to extend our apoapsis. And then we calculate throttle wanted by taking that increase, multiplying it by our gain, clamping to 0.1. So if we're more than 10 meters below, we're just going full throttle, which is the way we used to do. So this will roll off the throttle as our apoapsis gets within 10 meters of where it's supposed to be. And it moves so fast, that's why we get the burp, 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 burp as we get to altitude, because we push it above, then we say zero thrust, and then a tenth of a second later, it's come down a little bit, come down a little bit, come down. At some point it goes below it, and then we turn the engine on minimally for just one cycle, a tenth of a second, and that's enough to push it way up. So then we get our launch azimuth, and then we say, well, okay, what pitch? This is our heading. We'll need to fix that later on for inclined orbits properly. Say, what is our altitude as a fraction of the orbit altitude? That may be, it may be that we settle on for very high orbits. We'll always have this, be 80 kilometers if it's higher than 80. We'll see how this performs the first time we try to launch directly into a Kerbal synchronous orbit. Pitch wanted, altitude fraction, take the square root. So for small fractions, the square root bellies it out a bit. Okay. So for instance, if we were at a quarter of our altitude, then we would be pitched over halfway. Okay, so this will tend to pitch over faster earlier on and slower later, which gets us a curve that kind of levels out. And the exact shape of it is, we have to do the calculus on it. It's not going to be a parabola on its side. It's not going to be the square root, but it's kind of that kind of a shape. So that gets us our pitch. We set our throttle to the throttle that we want, and we clamp it between 0 and 1. And then we take our launch azimuth and our pitch wanted, and we set that into a heading, and we steer to that heading. All done. Do it every 10 seconds. And that gets us our nice pitch program where our ship pitches over faster in the beginning and slower in the end. Now that doesn't guarantee we're flying along the curve where our ship is always pointed parallel to the curve. We saw in the flight up, I don't know if you noticed that, but our nose tended to be, not on our prograde marker. So we are flying with significant angle of attack because we want to push it towards that pitch. Another thing you can do if you want to get really fancy is work out the math for the perfect gravity turn. So the theory is you start out at a small angle and then you always point your vehicle into the wind. So whatever your air velocity is, you're pointed directly into air velocity prograde, and you always thrust directly behind you. So the Japanese actually launched rockets like this for a long time. They're big sounding rockets. Basically, they didn't want to build guidance systems because that was too much like building a bomb. And, Japanese, very sensitive about that for many, many years post World War II. I think that's still in their constitution. But yeah, so they ended up getting very, very good at setting up a rocket at an angle and firing it and having it go exactly where they wanted it. And that's called a perfect gravity turn. And what you want to do for the most efficiency is you want a perfect gravity turn all the way up to where you turn off your engines and you're in a circular orbit. And that is well beyond me to do the math and do the design work. It involves tuning your engine and your payload and your fuel so everything is in perfect balance. And I don't think many people really do that. The fact that we have main engine cutoff somewhere other than on orbit tells me that they do more like what I'm doing here, which is you follow the curve. At some point you cut it off because you've got a trajectory that gets you higher, and when you get there you circularize. So that's our ascent. Enough nattering about gravity turns. Let's go take a look at circularization. That's a lot of code. It's a lot of math, but it only looks like a lot because I've broken out each step for clarity. We have some parameters for the control system. There is, if we want a certain amount of change in velocity, how much acceleration do we want? That's what that throttle gain is for. Basically, it's if you set that to 1/5, that would mean that you do a burn that gets you an acceleration that would meet your desired change in velocity in 5 seconds. If your gain is 5, it would meet it in 1/5 of a second. So this tries very aggressively to get accelerations that will hit our delta V. Max facing error says if you aren't pointed in the right direction, we don't want to thrust as much. I mean, obviously, if you want to go up and you're pointed sideways, you don't want to thrust a whole lot before you get turned up. And in this case, the default value for it is 5 degrees. So if we get 5 degrees off of where we're trying to point, we shut down the throttle, and we actually fall off smoothly until then. Good enough is our error is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and when the size of the error is small enough, and it's below 1, we're done. Okay, so that's our parameters. At the top we say, well, if we don't have any liquid fuel on the vessel, we're not going to get there. We are not going to circularize today. So I'm actually going to say something before I move on. So the plan here, I mentioned this earlier, is I'm going to take a look at my current altitude. I'm going to say, if I were in a circular orbit at this altitude, how fast would I be moving? And that, you take the mu value, which is the gravitational constant g times the mass of the planet. And yes, we know mu to more significant figures than we know g or the mass of the Earth. So mu is a great thing. That's mu is the strength of the gravitational field. So mu divided by how far we are from the center, which is our altitude over the body plus the radius of the body. So that gets us our desired lateral speed. Take the square root of that. That gets you how fast you have to go to be in a circular orbit. Direction. Well, we need to exclude, we've got up, which points away from the body, and we've got what velocity we currently have. So we have some speed that we're doing, right? So we take our current speed and we remove all the multiples of the up vector. So that means we end up with a vector that's in the lateral direction, which is the projection of our velocity onto the flat plane. So that gets our direction. So circularization, we don't change where we're pointed. We're just going to change up and down. So our desired velocity is just the lateral direction vector times the speed. So the direction vector we did has a length of 1. So if we multiply that by our speed, that's our velocity vector that we want. Well, what's our desired change? Well, the desired velocity minus our current velocity says here's how much we want to change our velocity by. Now maybe that's accelerating. Maybe that's pushing up or down a little bit. So there may be a vertical component in here. Maybe ascending and we want to flatten that out, or descending and we want to flatten that out. We saw that on our burn earlier where we were descending and our nose was above our prograde marker. So it was trying to bring our velocity vector up along with making it longer. So that gets us our velocity change. We say, wow, if that vector is small enough, we're done. If it's not small enough, what do we do? Okay, we take our desired velocity change vector, which is the correction we want to make. We want to point ourselves in that direction and fire our engines. Well, we're going to steer. Steering is not just a vector that you point the nose in. It also has a component for how you're rolled. So it's not a vector, it's a quaternion, it's an orientation. There's an additional degree of freedom there. I mean, you can point straight north that way, but are you straight north head up or straight north head down? So we're saying head up. Now facing top vector, that means I'm going to take whichever way I'm currently oriented and I'm pointed that way, and I want to swing what direction I'm pointed over that way, but I want to, as much as possible, have my top vector, way my head is pointed when I'm sitting there in the pilot seat. I want to keep that pointed the same direction. That'll keep me from just arbitrarily rolling the spacecraft. So that gives me a steering. Now, typically in earlier flights, what I've done is instead of all these being locals, there are locks. So each time we want the value, we'll recalculate it. You lock all these together, you do lock throttle to it. And what happens is every time it does a physical tick, it recomputes the whole thing, and it's very, very smooth. But it's also using up a lot of cycles. So I thought, for this go, how about I do this every 1/10 of a second down here, and I'll just recalculate it once every 1/10 of a second rather than once every physical tick, which could be 30 times a second or 60 times a second. So we do all the computation into a final local variable, and then we're going to lock steering to that variable. If I said lock steering to look dir up, it would do the look dir up every frippin' time. So we're just going to set the steering to where it's supposed to be right now, and in a few milliseconds, maybe that will change. If we recompute it, it'd be changing. We're going to keep it in the same place. So every 1/10 of a second, we're going to change our steering a little bit. So now, that gets us pointed in the right direction, and we know how much we want to change our speed by. If we don't have any available thrust, then cut our throttle and call back in 1/10 of a second, because we're probably staging. So get past there, we know we have some available thrust. Given our desired velocity change, we can take its magnitude. So let's say we want to do a change that's over, we want to bring our nose down and extend our speed. So we now have this vector. We take the length of it, and multiply that by the throttle gain. So the higher the throttle gain, the more thrust we're going to do for any given vector change. That gives us a desired acceleration, which we may or may not be able to attain. Well, we don't command acceleration, we command a throttle. And the throttle gives you a certain amount of force depending on the engine, and that force depending on them gives you a certain amount of acceleration depending on your mass. So I do that in individual steps. Take our desired acceleration. Force is mass times acceleration, so that's our force. That'll be in kilonewtons. And the desired throttle, you take the force and you divide it by the available force. So if we put our throttle at 100%, we would get a force equal to our available thrust. So this gives us our desired throttle. And we clamp that between 0 and 1 because our throttle can never go below 0 and can never go above 1. We may very well want more throttle than we can get here. And this especially early on when we first start circularizing, we may have a very large delta V, and we're not going to cancel all that out in 1/5 of a second. So that's going to clamp it. So we'll start off with full throttle. That's fine. Well, what if we're not pointed the right direction? Again, if my error is such that I want to, basically I'm too low, and I'm lower than my, I think, so let's say our velocity vector is pointing up like that. We want it to point this way, so we need to point down. My nose is pointed up, and I want to thrust that way. If I turn on my engine, it's going to do the wrong thing. So we're going to look at the angle between what direction I'm facing, the facing vector, and the desired velocity change. So that angle there, we're going to say, how many degrees is that? I would say, what fraction of my maximum error is that? So I'm allowed 5 degrees, and if that's 2 degrees, that's going to be 0.4. If I've got 5 degree allowed error and I'm 15 degrees off, that's going to be 3. So 1 minus that. So it's going to start out, if there's no error, it's going to be 1, and it's going to ramp down to 0 when we hit our maximum and go beyond that. Clap that to 0 and 1. And why did I call that ascent gain? I made a mistake in naming somewhere. I edited a name. This is the facing error factor. Facing error factor is a number between 0 and 1, where 1 is you can use full throttle, and 0 is please don't burn at all. So now we have a discounted throttle that says, okay, here is the computed throttle from last time, which may have been discounted because we are off angle, and that's what we're going to lock the throttle to. And that's our entire circularization, and you saw what happened when we were on orbit up there. Our velocity was high. We started out by burning with our nose low, and as our velocity vector came in flat, our nose came up. And then as we started going down, because we weren't circular velocity yet, we started to pitch our nose up and burned upwards to try to get ourselves back to this level velocity vector. So you saw us adapt our direction to try to home in on the proper velocity vector for the orbit that we were going to end up in. We did end up 5 kilometers lower. So yeah, we might want to do something about that, but not now. We set our launch altitude, our target altitude 80 kilometers. Ending up in a circular orbit at 75 is just fine. Although I'm a little disappointed. I figured that 30 seconds beforehand would be good enough. Let's take a look here. Decel, no, it's in coast. So phase coast controls when we start our circularization. So this says if the estimated time of arrival at apoapsis is under 30, then return 0. So we could extend this. If we make it bigger, it means we're going to start burning at a lower altitude. which means that we will put our nose down and start burning. One way of dealing with this might be to do the math, honestly do the math, figure out what our actual delta V needs to be to circularize, and then do some more even harder math and figure out how long it will take for us to do that. And then dealing with the fact that, as we saw here, I'm actually staging in the middle of this fripping burn. And how do you do that when you're staging from one engine that has high thrust to another engine that has lower thrust? How do you select your burn start so that your higher thrust engine gets part of it done, and then your lower thrust engine kicks in, and it's all kind of, you get half the delta V before you get to the peak and half of it after. That may be too much math. It's certainly too much for tonight. Anyway, so that's all I really wanted to go over. The rest of it's simple stuff. You can see all of these phases are just short little bits of code that says, until this condition is true, do something trivial and return a time. And you saw what it did as it came in for the landing. I think I am going to do something to give myself a little better control of the spacecraft there at the end, before I go and start the go get science stuff, but that's not something I'm going to stream. So I think we are done with the stream now, and I'm going to go off and putter around the KSP and start gathering science, and hopefully we will have enough science that we can get on to the next thing. Once you've got all the orbital science, I think the next thing is to send up a bunch of tourists into orbit and get some more funds before we start actually unlocking science. You start unlocking science, you start getting contracts with tourists that want you to do that. So yeah, let's keep it simple. So I will see you in the next stream. This one's a 45-minute stream. That's not too much. I was thinking this one might be an hour. So 45 minutes, that's good. See you next time.